So let's get started. Hello to everybody who is on here live and is watching this back later. This is week 1 for the tarot class, and I'm so excited because if you know me at all, you know that I adore tarot, and spending 6 weeks talking about tarot with other people who are excited about tarot is sort of a dream come true for me, for sure. So I'm going to put at the end of the class, I am going to, and leave on the recording, I'm going to do a screenshot and walk through the forums that are part of the things that you don't have to use them, but they are available there if you want to be able to interact with your classmates, ask me questions, that kind of thing. And I'm going to kind of walk through that just so if there's some people not sure how to use it, so I'm going to be walking through that. But I'm also going to put a place up on there if you do want to use the forums where maybe you can stop in and kind of give a brief synopsis of how you first were exposed to tarot and started your journey with tarot, because I would love to hear how you all got interested in tarot and what it is that drew you to tarot. So I thought before we get into the chat, I would do a little synopsis of my exposure to tarot. So I will do that. I was actually, I know most people taking the class watch me on YouTube, and so probably already know this, but we'll just pop it in there. And then I'm hoping that you all do the same in the forums, because I would love to see that. But I was raised quite a fundamental Baptist, very strict Baptist. And so tarot cards, playing cards, dice, anything of that nature was the devil's workshop. And so it was not something that I was ever exposed to other than it, being something real scary. And of course, what happens when you tell somebody there's something is really horrible, it makes you really interested, right? And so now I collect playing cards. I love dice. I have tons of dice sets, and I have more tarot decks than any one person needs. So reverse psychology does work if you use me as an example. But later, as a young adult, I was into I Ching, and I did read with playing cards, because as soon as I was an adult, I did start collecting and purchasing playing cards, and did read with playing cards. And I also worked with OMs, which is a Celtic tree divination system. And so I kind of worked with those 3 things, but I was just researching. This is, of course, back before the web is what the web is. I remember when the web came online, as we officially know it. I remember the day, because myself and a bunch of my hacker coder kind of friends were like, oh, it's so obnoxious, bright colors, and everybody's flashing things. And we were all just disgusted, because we were like pure text kind of people. So it was before then, so there wasn't as much research, and I did research different divination systems. And the first thing that I did see was the Rider-Waite-Smith. I saw tarot, and it had some images, and it was a traditional Rider-Waite-Smith images. And I when I saw it, I thought I saw like the devil, the judgment card, the Pope, or the Hierophant card, and I thought, oh, this is really based on, this is more Christian ideology. I hadn't gone, again, I just saw some images, and I thought, oh, well, that's not, I'm kind of moving down a different path. I was more on a Buddhist path, and again, studying I Ching and meditating and things. And so I was like, that seems like it's going backwards for me, because it's just based on a Christian ideology. And I never really looked at it again after that. And then a few years later, I was in Maine visiting a friend of mine, and she and I had stopped in at a shop, and it wasn't a tarot shop or even a bookstore. It was it was like little gifts. It had all different kinds of things, little sections of gifts and things like that. And they had a section with some decks, and they had a deck out on the table, and it was the Llewellyn Tarot, not the Llewellyn Classic, but the Llewellyn Tarot, which is based on Welsh mythology. I'm a huge, since grade school, mythology buff and fanatic. And so when I saw that, and you were able to pick up the cards, and they had a deck that was out, and so I was able to look at the deck of cards, and it is somewhat, I would say, based on Rider-Waite-Smith, but it's also put in the construct of the Welsh mythology. And so the cards like the Devil and Judgment, and those kinds of cards were changed to fit the Welsh or pagan mythology more. And so I thought, oh, this is really beautiful, and I bought it. And I thought, okay, well, maybe there's more to tarot than I thought. And that was, I don't know, I would say at this point, 16 years ago, brought it home. And so then for the next 9.5 years, I had that tarot deck, the Llewellyn Tarot. I had Brian Froud Heart of Fairy Oracle, and then I had a Celtic Ogham Oracle cards. And that's what I had for 9.5 years that I used. But then the only book that I had was a little pocket book that has Marseille pictures, so Pip style pictures, and the meanings and things were more based on Pip cards and numerology. And of course, numerology was something I used actually with playing cards, the way that I read playing cards. And so my learning to read tarot was based on both sets, the basic, the guidebook that was with the Llewellyn Tarot, which had the mythology in it, but did have basic Rider-Waite-Smith meanings, and then a guidebook that was based more on numerology and Pip style reading. And so that is how I learned to read tarot. And then when I was getting ready to thinking about starting to read professionally, I did spend 2 years really intensely studying the Rider-Waite-Smith system, just so that I would have that as a basis and a core, because I think that, as you can see from the class and the way that the recommendation was to have a Rider-Waite-Smith version of the deck and to have a Pip deck, that I actually think that's a great way to learn, because that's how I'm going to be teaching you, because it does give you the basis of the Rider-Waite-Smith tradition, which is many, if I would say the majority of decks today, and we have so many more decks than we ever had available, at least that I was ever aware of in my little town today, than we ever did back 15, 16, 17 years ago. But the majority of those decks are based off of the Rider-Waite-Smith system. Most books that you purchase will be based on the Rider-Waite-Smith system. And so having an understanding and a core knowledge of that system, I think, is actually quite important. And then also being able to read and find tips and tricks and things to be able to read without being dependent upon the images, I think is also important, because it does help give you flexibility when you move, as today most of us have multiple decks, and having that gives you that flexibility that you can tap into core basic meanings without the help of the images, can really give you flexibility when you're moving back and forth between decks. So that's how I was exposed. I haven't looked back since then. I have always been reading for friends and family, and then I started reading professionally. I think it's maybe going on 3 years now that I've started to read professionally. So that's kind of my little tip into that. I am going to quickly, before we get into the lecture, some people have emailed asking sort of for book recommendations. I don't actually have a ton of, I only like to recommend what I've actually read. And I don't have a lot of tarot decks, because I was reading for quite a while before I sort of moved into the age of all of the books and things. And so I already had my system set. So I'm kind of one of those people that I'm a book addict. So I try with reference books to keep 1 or 2 of each thing that I, so a couple geomancy books, a couple, everything that I do, try to keep a couple core books. And so I wanted to just quickly give you what books I have, so that, because people have emailed that. Because I do think it's helpful to have books. I think you can get overwhelmed by books, just like you can, if you're new to tarot, you can get overwhelmed by tons of tarot decks really quickly, as well as tons of books really quickly. I'm all for resources big time, but as a new reader, if you're coming to tarot new, I think that having sort of a core set, I always recommend, when people ask me, a Rider-Waite-Smith deck, pip style deck. And for people who are wondering, pips simply mean that the images on the minors are simply images of what they are. And we're going to show some examples of those. But a pip deck simply means that there aren't scenes on the minor cards. There are just 5 cups or 6 swords or something of that nature. There's not really scenes. They can be beautifully illustrated, but they don't have people and scenes. And so having one pip deck, one Rider-Waite-Smith deck, and then maybe a deck that you just have fallen in love with and you love it. And then just work with those, because I think that I've seen a lot of people over the past few years, especially within the YouTube community and talking to new people who are new to tarot, getting overwhelmed by books and overwhelmed by decks, that what sometimes happens is we get so excited about the collecting aspect, which is wonderful, and acquiring books and things, that we don't actually get the cards on the table, right? Because, you know, I'm all for knowledge base, because I think that allows your intuition to really have a bigger playground when you have a solid knowledge base. But at some point, you have to take that knowledge base and use it. You have to gain what I call experiential knowledge, the knowledge of putting the cards on the table consistently and starting to sort of figure out for yourself how those cards show up. And sometimes when we get kind of bombarded by a lot of resources that are wonderfully available now, we are simply acquiring knowledge, and we don't stop to put the cards on the table. So we're definitely going to encourage through the next 6 weeks. There won't be, starting next week, that we'll be throwing cards on the table, because that's how you're best going to learn. But the books that I have, so for pip style reading, for Marseille style, more traditional reading style, my favorite book is called Tarot of the Open Reading, which is by Yoav Bendov. And when I send a link to this video, that's, to be able to watch the video back, I will put links to these books as well, so that you can easily find them. This name has changed because Llewellyn has since published this, but this is one of my favorites. It's just really a basic of reading historical decks, looking at directions, looking at colors, because there were very few colors that were used in the older decks, and they use those to read with. There's lots of just key sim and numerology. So I just find this to be a really great basic book on reading more like a historical style decks. And so I have this, I love this. His teacher, Yoav Bendov's teacher, Jodorowsky, also wrote a book that is a little bit more, it goes a little bit more in depth, a little bit more esoteric, perhaps a little bit more into his personal spirituality and the way that he sees the cards. But I've heard it highly recommended. But this one is much more stripped down and just sort of basic card reading, and so I really love that. The other one that I have for reading pip style is more of a workbook, and it's called Tarot on Earth by Tom Benjamin, who also has a YouTube channel. But I really like this. This is really great if you are new to reading with pips, because he kind of walks you through thinking about, there are workbook pages and things for you to work out what these particular numbers and these types of things mean to you. So it's a little less about saying, read it this way, and it's a little bit more of, okay, these are some traditional ways to read it, but what does this mean to you? So this is really nice for that. So that's the 2 books that I have on pip style reading. And then for Rider-Waite-Smith, I have Holistic Tarot. I have actually the Kindle version of this as well. I don't actually recommend Kindle versions for reference books, and this is a reference book. This is probably the biggest book on tarot out there, but it is a fantastic reference book. Don't be intimidated by the size. You are not, it's not really meant to be read from cover to cover. It's meant to sort of look up specific things. I personally think the appendix is the best part of it. It's just amazing, the amount of charts and graphs and things. I'm a huge researcher. So this kind of stuff just makes me extremely excited. So if a lot of people are intimidated by the size, but again, you're not going to read this like a book. You're just going to be able to use it as a reference. And I think it's fantastic. If you have only one Rider-Waite-Smith book, I would say probably this one or the next one. And the reason that I love this next one, and then I have this on Kindle, which again, I don't actually recommend for reference books. I'm finding it's not the best way to be able to just to flip through and I don't know, I am finding I like my reference books to be on a physical book, but we all have different. But it's called Tarot Wisdom by Rachel Pollack. Now Rachel Pollack is known for, and she's on our timeline, for her 78 Degrees of Wisdom, which this is sort of the updated version of that. And one of the reasons that I love this is that she shows multiple decks. She discusses multiple, both Rider-Waite-Smith as well as Pip style historical decks, as well as more modern decks. And so of all of the more modern books that I've looked at, this is a great book because in each of the cards, when you're going through each of the cards, you have a visual representation of a historical style deck, a Rider-Waite-Smith traditional deck, and a couple more modern style tarot decks to be able to kind of see on one page the different ways in which that particular card might be referenced. And so that's one of the, and I just like, she's so very thorough, and there's a lot of history here. She actually gives the definitions from the cards of various historical sources, so you can see the way that the card meanings have even changed across the time. So I'm a huge fan of this Tarot Wisdom by Rachel Pollack. So those are the 4 books that I have on tarot. And so quite a few people again had messaged me about that, so I wanted to make sure that I touched on those. That gives us a little intro how I got into tarot. It gives us a little idea of some books if you haven't already collected some books. If you have books that you have absolutely loved learning tarot from, pop on the forums and leave that, we could start a book thread because that can only help people. Although again, I'm really encouraging people to not get too overwhelmed by books so that you can actually work with the cards, because that's where you're going to get your best knowledge. The handouts that you're going to be getting for the next couple weeks are going to be fairly print intensive, because I am going to provide a page for each tarot card with room with some basic core correspondences, and then room for you to be able to start to again write your experiential knowledge, or as you're looking at other books and you come across something that's interesting to you, that you can kind of jot that down and keep that. I should try to find mine. I have when I first started online with tarot, I had made up some journal pages for myself and it popped them up online. This was quite a few years ago, and that's what I did. Every time I'd read something about a particular card would stick out, or I would get it in a reading that would be in an interesting way, I would just keep notes of that. And so I think that's a great way to start to collate the knowledge for yourself that's important or that really stands out to you, or again that shows up in a reading for yourself. So you'll be having that. So there will be quite a lot of print. I do apologize, but I do think it's important to have all that so you can start to build that up. So, I really struggled with, okay, do we do sort of what we're doing today, which is looking at the history of tarot? But I think that this is actually really important to sort of ground ourselves. And sometimes we can have been reading tarot for quite some time and not really have a firm foundation or a basic understanding of the history of tarot. And I think that is something, it's a gap that can be filled in. There are all kinds of mythologies surrounding the history of tarot, which are fun. And I'm a person that believes in the power of myth. I truthfully do believe that sometimes myth is more important than factual truth, because some things we're never going to know. The very nature of paper, things being written down on paper means that things disintegrate and then are lost. And so there are many things that we don't know about how people, when people actually started using tarot cards for divinatory purposes. We don't know some of that because of the transitory nature of paper, and wars that come in certain areas, because tarot was in a very a focused area where there were takeovers. We did have France taking over Italy and wars taking over, and then tarot production shifting into France. And so we had those kinds of things that took place in which we have gaps. And so I think that whether you're a person who believes in the mythology of tarot, that maybe, you know, this was some hidden book that came out of Egypt, that was a real popular one that came in the I would say in the late 1700s, it started to sort of, England was really interested in Egypt and all things Egyptian. And so a lot of the esoteric talk was linking things with Egypt. And so we have mythologies of it coming out of the secret book of magic and things that came out of Egypt, and it's been encoded and passed down through the deck of tarot cards. We have stories of it being passed across the world through the Romani or Gypsies that either started it and or sometimes just moved it out of Egypt and got it circulating around. There are all kinds of mythologies and stories surrounding the origins of tarot. And Rachel Pollack talks about it in Tarot Wisdom as well, that's okay. Like the stories and the myths that surround a culture, a religion, a system such as tarot only serve to sort of bring that mystique there, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there are historical facts that we can look at surrounding tarot, and I think that for me, that's something that's very interesting, as well as informative. So I did want to quickly touch on the decks that you will see in your handouts as well as in the slideshows, because obviously in terms of what you put in a handout for people to print is going to rely very heavily on copyright. There's only certain things that you can use. In terms of the Rider-Waite-Smith, the images that we're going to see, there are several different versions of the Rider-Waite-Smith. There's Pam A, Pam B, Pam, I don't know if there's a C, I think there's a C and a D. There's multiple versions. Many of those are in various stages of copyright to, say, US Games and things of that nature, which is a whole topic in and of itself, in which I'm not going to go in, but we'll be using the Pam A 1909 version of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck imagery, because that is one that is outside of copyright, at least in the US. And then the other one that I'll be using for a pip style images is the CBD tarot, which is actually Yoav Bendov took the Conver. So in 1760, Nicholas Conver did a Marseille style tarot deck, and Yoav Bendov restored that. And one of the key things about this restoral is that a lot of times, such as this teacher Jodorowsky, some people, when they restore decks, they actually tweak them, change them, add things in, that works with the way that they see tarot. Whereas Dr. Bendov's goal was to restore, just clean up the line work, clean up the colorations, but not to make any kind of changes. But what he also did, he passed away last year, which was very sad. I think it's a big resource to tarot that has been lost. But one of the things that he's always done is keep those images available to the public for free, copyright. Obviously, you can't sell, make your own deck and sell sell it, but in terms of usage, all of the images. I'll put a link in the email that I send. You can download printable versions of his deck, viewable versions of his deck. You can download his little white book for free. He really wanted to have these resources open and available to everybody. So if you don't want to purchase a PIP deck for the sake of this class, you can actually download these images and have them printed off, or print them off on your printer on maybe a thicker paper, and have access to these images for free, which is fantastic resource that you don't see a lot of. People are pretty copyright intensive these days, for good reason, but it's nice to see somebody who is just sharing those out for people to be able to gain the knowledge and exposure to an older deck. So those are the two decks that you will see on any handouts as well as on the slideshow. So I want to make sure I talk about that real quick. So you have, now I try to, with all of the slide information, I try to make sure that you have the pertinent information in your handouts as well. That way, you know, because we're not going to obviously talk through every single one of these points. There is also in your handout the address. This is a part. This is just a little grabbing things that I thought were important out of a very large timeline of tarot that can be really interesting to look through. So I highly recommend that you take a look, and I will put a link to that in the email that I send with the finished version of this, so that you can just click on it and go over there. And I highly recommend that you take a look at it. I know that a lot of times people feel that history is dry and boring and all of that, but I think it can be also fascinating to see how certain things influenced each other, and how that all of these confluence of events happen in order to come to tarot the way that we are today. Such as, if you look at the first thing, the paper bills coming into Italy, you know, that is a key component. If you look at playing cards, which technically came more from China, started in China, as far as we can tell, playing cards started in China, and they would have originally been tiles, because again, paper wasn't readily available, and then even when paper was available, it was expensive, and so it started out more as tiles and then worked its way to being paper, which of course eventually first was very expensive and then became a cheap way to be able to pass things out. But we know that playing cards started in China and then moved from China to India, and then was brought over to, with the trade routes, was brought over to Italy from India. But getting those paper mills into Italy was a key component to starting to have playing cards. So it's really interesting to see the way those kind of events, trade routes and paper mills and things of that nature, are what sort of are the foundation for being able to have, of course, we take for granted, right? We can go into even Barnes and Nobles, and there's at least a big shelf full of tarot decks. And certainly in England, I know you can go in London, there's like, you know, this, you can take this a trip through all of these amazing tarot shops in London. It's like six or seven shops that you can kind of travel your way through, just filled with decks. And if you go on Amazon, we're looking at just this amazing number of decks that all started in 1215, when Italy, you know, started to get a paper mill, and because of the trade routes and all of that, which I just personally, I'm a geek and I find that stuff to be really fascinating. So we, and what's also interests me is, if you look on here, when it entered into the Italian ports, this is in 1370, right? Already we had those quartz that we're used to, or those suits that we're used to, the swords, they call them batons, but they were wands, very giant wands. They look like, I love the quartz in older decks of the batons, because they look like these giant clubs, like we see like little magical wands, but they were these giant clubs, look like they could beat somebody with these big clubs. But those were there. The cups and the coins were in place in the 1300s, which I think is really amazing. that still exists today. And it started back at the beginning of even playing cards starting. At this time, these would have been just what we know as the minors. However, as a second point notes, in 1350s, in the mid to late 1300s, they were already, we do have, I think just the Petrarch, just one written account where they were talking about the triumphs, which becomes the major arcana. So the discussion about that was already in place in the mid 1300s, which I think is, again, really amazing. And then I just put a couple, but you can read the full timeline, and you'll see that they found, like order slips where somebody has ordered a couple decks of cards, and we can start to see where they became much more accessible for everyday people. So maybe started with, dukes and higher people, wealthier people, having the playing cards, and then you'll start to see from the orders where people are ordering a couple decks for their kids, and we can see where it starts to get much more cheaper and much more accessible, but the early decks, such as in 1441, the Carrie Yale, aka the Madrone, which we will look at a couple pictures after we kind of look at this. We're going to look at sort of a picture moving through the time period, and then I have some decks that we can look at afterwards. The first two decks that we still have in existence today would be what we would be known as the Madrone. It's also known as the Carrie Yale now because of who has the actual cards, the remaining cards that are still in existence. Carrie Yale has those in their library, and so it's called the Carrie Yale now, but it used to be called the Madrone. And then the Sforza from 1450. So we're talking about mid 1400s. We have two decks that are fairly intact, especially the Sforza. The Sforza is only missing 4 cards out of the deck, and so we have really intact versions of this, which is absolutely, I think, amazing. Again, giving its paper, but these were for the wealthy, right? These were for the high Visconti and Sforza family, and the Madrones, and these were individual paintings with gold gilding on them. And so we're talking about, and I know that the Sforza has holes in it in each of the cards where it was probably made not even to really play with, because they were individual paintings and would have been hung on a wall. So the entire deck could have been hung on the wall more as an exhibit of this amazing and beautiful art. We can get that. US Games printed that last year, where you can actually see, it's just amazing that we're able to, do readings with cards that were around and just came into being in the mid 1400s. Again, Tarot Geek, I think it's awesome. I also like the idea we started to see frescoes and paintings on walls of people playing tarocchi or tarocchi. You ask 12 people and they'll give you 5 different ways in which to pronounce it, which is a game. So again, this started out as the minor cards as we would know of playing cards, and then it was added in the idea of the triumphs or the major arcana. They were trumped in a trick-taking game. They could triumph or trick take. I don't know how to play the game. People still play it, and you can still play it. So it was used, although one of the interesting things is that while we might, I am one of those people who do think that tarot came from playing cards, and I don't think that that's a negative thing. I think it's awesome that we were able to, throughout, I think, the entire existence of human beings, we have picked up things that are around us in order to divine. People picked up sticks, people picked up bones, people picked up dice for lots, people picked up cards, people picked up everything that was around them. We all have, I think, as human beings, that desire to answer questions and see beyond what we can see right here and now, and look into the future and try to figure out what's going on. This is I think a internal drive of human beings, because we have picked things up that are every day around us to use to divine. And the fact that people picked up playing cards and then ended up using those to become what it is today, I think think is a beautiful thing. I don't think that it minimizes or in any way takes away from the magic of tarot. I think it actually bolsters it, that understanding of that need for people to look deeper, to go inward, to go outward, to go forward, and with their questions is so strong that we pick up whatever's around us in order to do that. I think that's amazing. We also have evidence that the trump cards, you know, they weren't just haphazardly placed the way that they are, and they have stayed fairly static. You know, there was some movement in the earlier days. The triumphs or the major arcana cards were not numbered. They started to get numbered, but at first they weren't numbered. So we didn't have strict understandings of how the orders were, other than that there are books and notes in different books that do list out the triumphs in order. And they have pretty much stayed the way that they were, with some variation excuse me, that we'll talk about, but with some variations. But for the most part, they've stayed that way. And there is also evidence that the reason why those triumphs or trump cards were picked, the ones that they were with that understanding and the thought that went into thinking about the way that man grows and develops and sort of comes into higher knowledge and kind of starts at the base. Because, you know, originally the fool was much more of a lunatic or a mad person that really wouldn't have had a lot of intellect or a lot of thought processes going on, all the way, you know, to this culmination in the world where everything kind of pulls together and is complete. And so it was much more of, even while it might have been a game, the reason those cards were chosen as trumps were because of that understanding and that watching of the progress of man. So even though you can say, oh, well, it came from a game, the reason why those cards are chosen to be painted and reproduced over and over again do have meaning that we are still working with today, which is, again, really, really cool. And so again, you can see, I highly recommend, just take a little bit of time, go take a look at the full timeline. It's fascinating to see the progression of things and how they went, and the way that historians have gone back and like looked at receipts and looked at books that a lot of times they are sermons where they're preaching against tarot cards and gaming cards. At first, not because they were used for divination, but because they were gaming and lot taking and gambling, those kinds of things that the church would have, would be against. And there were times in which we had the Pope and the Popess that were now became the high priestess. And then there were times in which the Pope, you know, there were rules saying, no, you can't there cannot be, you know, images of the Pope on playing cards. And so those had to be removed. And so then you have other cards, I think Jupiter and Juno get placed on it in one of the decks because there was a ban against putting the image of the Pope on there. It's just fascinating to see the way things are. It's not until the 1800s or 1700s, I'm sorry, late 1700s, and then definitely in the 1800s, you see a boom of people starting to discuss tarot strongly as divination and esoteric knowledge. Is this connected to the Kabbalah? Is this connected to astrology? Is this connected to Egypt? All these things start to really percolate, and people start to really layer on meanings and things of that nature in those time periods, and it starts to get really juicy in terms of trying to, you know, all these people sitting around, men in rooms trying to figure out, you know, what is the magic of this system. But we do have indication, even as early as the 1500s, where a poet wrote sonnets, and the whole purpose, the story of the poem was the fact that this poet walked into a room and people were having tarot cards drawn, and the card that they drew had to do with their fate. This was telling them their fate. So even earlier on, we do have indication indications that they were being used for divination. We certainly know that playing cards, straight up playing card decks, were used in a divinatory way, but it was the late 1700s and then into the 1800s where you really start to see people trying to sort out and be the first to sort of break the code of tarot. And so you ended up with, though, a lot of competition of kind of who has the best story feel on some of the of how that what these could mean, and this came from Egypt and this happened here, and you almost have a bit of a esoteric group competition to come up with the best history of where tarot may have come to, which is quite interesting to follow through. But then that brings us kind of all the way up to 1909, when we have Arthur E. Waite creating the Rider-Waite deck. And it was known as the Rider-Waite deck. Currently, in modern times, people have added Smith on there, and obviously recognition of Pamela Coleman Smith, who did the illustrations for the deck. She was an illustrator who was hired to do the illustrations. However, she was part of the Golden Dawn. And you'll see in the listing in 1888 where the Golden Dawn, which was a society of people who were, claiming esoteric knowledge, gathering up old documents and resources, and trying to make sure that esoteric knowledge wasn't lost. They had their whole, we're going to talk about that in a next slide. So this was a society of people come together, and Pamela Coleman Smith, as well as Arthur Waite, were both part of the Golden Dawn. So while she was an illustrator, she was also part of the society. And the deck was, that the story goes anyways, that part of the initiation, when you reached a certain level in this secret, I don't know if it was considered secret at the time, but in this esoteric society, you would reach a certain level, and then there was the Golden Dawn had sort of their version of the tarot deck that had all of their correspondences that they gathered in, and then you would create your own tarot deck. But Arthur Waite actually made it with scenes on it. And again, it's not the first scenic. A lot of times, one of the misunderstandings that gets put about is that the Rider-Waite Smith was the first scenic tarot deck. So the first tarot deck in which there weren't just numbers of cups or swords, but there were actually scenes in the minor, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. I mean, you can go back to the Solabusca, which we can take a look at, which was even before the Sforza and the Madrone, in which every single one had a scene on it. There are other decks that were scenic. By and large, the minors were more pip style, but the Rider-Waite Smith was not the first to do that. So that's one of my pet peeves when people say that, oh, it's the first scenic deck. It's like, no, it wasn't. But it was the first deck, I think, whose purpose was to try to make it accessible to the public. And certainly that is something that they succeeded at. I think that there, which we'll talk a little bit more as we go through the cards, there were some questions of whether Waite was trying to keep some of the knowledge of the Golden Dawn hidden. And so there were changes that were made, such as even the correspondence of the wands as fire versus air, and the swords being air instead of fire. So there were some switches to what were often looked at, and some correspondence changes that people, again, the mythology is that were deliberately done in order to not release all of the esoteric knowledge of the Golden Dawn. And then Crowley came out with the Thoth Tarot, which is much more accurate from historical understanding. The correspondences of Crowley's Thoth deck are much more one-to-one to the teachings of the Golden Dawn. And so you have that come out, and then, history was changed for the English-speaking world in terms of tarot. I know that people in Europe get a little bit frustrated with the Rider-Waite-Smith, the idea that sort of tarot sprang from the Rider-Waite-Smith, and that, you know, this is the popularity of tarot came about because of this one deck, when it, you know, obviously has been popular for so many years throughout Europe. And even when the boom was, you know, being taken place in terms of esoteric knowledge, these were on European Marseille and Pip style historical decks that were going on well before the Rider-Waite-Smith came out. But for the English speaking world, certainly the Rider-Waite-Smith deck took it to a new level. And certainly in, I think it was, I should have had that on there, but I think it was 77 when US Games obtained a version of the copyright of the Rider-Waite-Smith and started to really push it out for the masses. We did see a huge boom in the, you know, common everyday people having access to tarot, and books started to be written, and the rest is history. Like, here we sit today, right? I know that's a lot of talk about history, but I personally find it to be fascinating. And I also find it to be important to sort of know your history. Like when you go to grade school and high school, you learn history every single year. You're taking a history class because it's important to know your history, your country's history, your area, your region's history. It's all important. And so if you're going to be learning and reading tarot, understanding your history and where things came from is another layer that I think is interesting, is important. So taking a drink. Jada, we'll get into that. Ask about how I see wands. I see the wands as fire and the swords as air, although I understand why you could read it the other way. But we'll definitely, when we get into talking about the minors, we'll be going through that's not actually a set in stone thing. No correspondences are. One of the things that we can learn from history is that we don't know exactly how any of these things were read. We do have a fairly good idea of how playing cards were read, but even that changed dramatically from region to region, sometimes from family to family, that people would have family ways of reading and that they would pass on, you know, to the next person in the family that could be very different than somebody 2 streets over, right? And so I think that one of the things that's important to know about tarot is there's really not a right and a wrong way. There are traditional ways, there are modernly accepted ways of reading things, and certainly with decks that now have very concrete images and scenes on it, those kind of, if you're using that particular deck, it can really be quite obvious what it is that they are, what correspondences that the creator has put on top of them. But there aren't, while we have sort of traditions that have built up around tarot, there's not a right and a wrong way historically to read tarot. And I think that's one of the things that's wonderful, because it really opens things up. And one of the reasons that I encourage people to work with a Pip style deck that is less scenic on the minors is because it opens up to your understanding of what these numbers or suits, and we'll be talking about all of those things. Next week we'll be talking, focusing on the major arcana, and then we'll be focusing on the minor arcana, and see that there are just so many different correspondences that can be layered, sometimes to the degree in which it gets like, okay, let's strip some of this back a little bit, right? So you may not be interested in astrology. Do you have to associate astrology with tarot? No, you don't. That might be your interest, and so you might, but you don't have to. There are, you know, are you somebody who is interested in the Kabbalah? Okay, well, there's lots of correspondences, especially in the major arcana, to the Kabbalah, but you don't have to use the Kabbalah correspondences. And so starting to come up with what are important to you, what are key correspondences that are important to you and that work for you as you read, can really open up to your your own personal way of reading with a pip deck that doesn't have sort of the creator's meanings built into the scenes. And so that's one of the reasons why I think that it can be very freeing to work with a pip style deck. I obviously work with both. I have a lot of decks and I love all of them, but my favorite to probably read with is a pip style deck, simply because I have very solid understanding of what the cards mean to me. And so not having to talk around a particular scene and say, yeah, I know there's a dead person on the ground with 10 swords, but this is what it really means, is very freeing for the way that I read. Anyways, we will talk about that a little bit later. We're going to just quickly, since we just babbled a lot, let me take a drink real quick and see what time it is. See how horrible I was. My friend Patrick, he has carefully curated a collection of decks that go across the time. That he makes sure that he has 1 or 2 decks in each 100-year chunk leading up to the modern time. And so I asked him to please send me pictures of each one so that we can kind of visually see some of these cards, because we haven't, all of us haven't seen all of these cards perhaps. And I think it's really neat just to see visually the way that decks have shifted and changed over the years. So this first one is the Madrone. Modern decks or modern renditions of this are often called the Carrie Yale. And this, again, dates can be somewhat iffy. You know, they try to guesstimate when the dates were, but this would have been from between 1441 and 1447 that this deck was created, and it's beautiful. I mean, obviously, this is these images are reproductions of what the cards look like now, so they have obviously lost paint off of them, a lot of the gilding. Some of the cards still have gilding, some of them you can tell that there was gilding there that has gone away, but they still exist, which is wonderful. Like the originals still exist, which is just amazing, that from that long ago on paper that we can still have these cards. So this would have been the Madrone. The Visconti Sforza we know was from 1451, and this is much more of the gilding seems to have survived. We can definitely see it's very heavily gilded. Obviously, you can see from the Emperor card here in the front that a lot of it has worn away. Sometimes the people's bodies almost kind of blend into the background, but from some of the cards that do still have more detail, we can see that the backgrounds were just like tapestries of just gorgeous gold gilded tapestries in the backgrounds. I mean, it was an art. It was you know, each one was hand painted. Beautiful Visconti Sforza, again, hand painted. This was not something that was accessible to the common person. This is something that was, as we can see, you can kind of see here, even in the reproductions, that there were holes in all the cards. This was not something even this family probably would have used. They're very large. They were probably just meant for display purposes, but we still have them. We can still see them. We can still use them, which is just amazing. So this is from 1480. Now we're starting to see more of woodcut types, where they would have woodcut plates that they could use to basically stamp in mass production. Not quite the same way that we mass produce cars, but we start to see where the card, and this is where there are gaps where we don't have, especially in, I believe, the 14 and 1500s, there aren't a lot. And I think that if we think about the card decks that would have been made for public consumption, that would have been cheaper so that people were able to purchase those cards, those are going to be the same quality of paper, and that they aren't going to last as long. Plus, people threw them away. They were using them for the most part. They were using them for playing card games, literally for playing card games. That kind of ran together there, for playing card games, and perhaps again sitting at the table and telling each other's fortunes, but they weren't things that were carefully kept under glass or anything of that nature. And so unfortunately that means that we've lost some, but we do have some. And this is the, again, example of the Rosenwald is actually a really sweet the faces on. A lot of times some of the older decks, for me, the woodcut, I'm not a huge fan of woodcut Marseille style decks. I don't think they're all that pretty to me. Some people love them, but this is actually a very sweet one from 1480. The Budapest would have been later. It would have definitely been after the Rosenwald. And I think this is the one in which everybody's eyes are cross-eyed. I don't understand why, the artist, I mean, clearly you could see that everybody's eyes were cross-eyed. Why, whether it was just an issue with the woodcut, and I just like, whatever, don't worry about it. But it's quite hilarious because almost everybody's eyes in it are cross-eyed. You can start to see, now this is a reproduction in which somebody, I think, has actually hand painted it, but you'll see in a lot of older decks, especially if they're reproductions of the actual older deck, that they would, you know, stamp the image, and then they would also then sometimes stamp the colors. So there's usually only 3 or 4 colors, and a lot of times they didn't line up correctly, so they would be, you know, kind of off center and those kinds of things, because again, mass production, and I use that mass production quite loosely speaking, you know, was a very different process, and there was definitely not an exact science versus today, when obviously you can purchase a deck and from US Games, and I can purchase a deck from US Games, and they're going to look exactly the same because of production. But it's really, I think it's fascinating to see. This is a beautiful, and this comes more, I think this is a pastel, but in the 1500s, this is a Fina della Torre, and absolutely beautiful rendition. And I love that Patrick has put, he actually gave me this deck for Christmas because this Justice card, people have said this Justice card looks like me. It looks like a younger me, which is pretty cool. So this is, but look at the backing on this. Most of the time the card backs were either simple patterns or just straight one color, like you saw with the Sforza and the Madrone would have been just kind of straight colored paper, or sometimes not even have anything on the back. But this is an interesting one because it does have this kind of scene of Cupid on the back of the deck, which I think is really pretty. This is the Bessicon tarot from the 1700s, and you definitely start with the Noblet and the Dodal. You definitely start to see the idea of the Marseille, and this is another, I think, a misconception. A lot of people use the term Marseille tarot to indicate any deck that is a pip deck. A pip deck simply means there are no scenes in the minor. There are 5 cups sitting there, or 7 swords, or 3 coins. There's not a there's no people, there's no scenes going on. It's just the image. It's like a playing card deck. Those are called pips. When you look at the 5 of hearts, those 5 hearts are pips. A Marseille deck is a pip deck, but not all pip decks are Marseille decks. Marseille decks was a standard started to emerge, in which the major arcana looked generally almost identical, and the configuration of the pips, so how, say, the 8 of coins was situated or configured on the card, became more solidified with the Noblet and the Dodal. And so a Marseille deck is a pip deck, but it is a pip deck that has, I think, 2 variations of the way that the pips are configured. And so today, sometimes people create decks and they call them Marseille decks, when they really should just be calling them pip decks, because Marseille means a very specific configuration of pips. But these become what we often think about when we think of historical decks. And you can see right here from this beautiful two of swords over here. I don't know if you can see, I think you can see my mouse moving, but you can see that on the right, that they were sometimes very beautifully illustrated. There were often plants growing, flowers, and things that were growing that readers of Marseille use, those as well as the actual number and the image. They actually use the foliage that are on the cards and the illustrations on the cards in their reading. But so the miners are quite beautiful. I'm just not a huge fan myself of sort of the woodcut imagery, but we got to see this. Now this is an example of one of my favorite decks. Now I have this is the Soprafino Tarot, which was I think 1832. 1835, the Soprafino. Lo Scarabeo has a mass-produced version called the Ancient Italian Tarot, and this is one of my all-time favorite decks, which was in my recommended decks for pip decks, because the pips are absolutely gorgeous. And this is the original. This is a reproduction of the original. They have changed the minors. I actually like the minors better in this one, because they're absolutely stunning. So I know that is historical heresy, but and you can still get the reproductions that stay true to it. I just really love the minors of this deck. It shows how absolutely beautiful, and we'll be looking at these more closely when we get to the minors, but it shows how beautiful pip decks can actually be, that they don't need to be. There are beautiful illustrations and keys and things to look at besides just the numbers as well. But this is and you can see this beautiful scene even in the moon card, that sometimes these were just beautiful works of art as well. You know, this is not something that would be painted versus a woodcut, which you definitely see a lot more of in the 1800s. And then 1909, we have the Rider-Waite-Smith show up. And this is, I don't know, I know he's got a couple or I think this is an actual, I know he has an actual Pam B or C, I think. And so this is probably that we're seeing here, an actual version of the Rider-Waite-Smith that we all recognize. I think that most people, if you were to show, even that don't read tarot, if they think about tarot, it's probably from images of this deck. And so it certainly has that has become in the English-speaking world what is recognized as tarot today. So that would have been in 1909. 1944, we have the Thoth Tarot come out from Crowley. He actually created it, I believe, in World War II, but it wasn't published. It was a book that was published that had the images in it, and the paintings, which were beautifully, beautifully done, were shown in a gallery, but the deck itself wasn't published until 1944. And so this is a version of this. And again, from what I can understand, the Thoth Tarot is probably the closest where the correspondences of the Golden Dawn stay the most accurate, and as they compared to the correspondences that we see in the Rider-Waite-Smith. We are not going to be talking about the Thoth. In many ways, it's its own system. You often think about sort of Marseille historical style deck reading, the Rider-Waite-Smith system, and the Thoth system as sort of the three branches of tarot. Certainly people who read Thoth can look at Rider-Waite-Smith and say, that's not real tarot. People who are Rider-Waite-Smith people say, oh, you know, Thoth, that is not real tarot. Historical decks, no, that's not real tarot. We all, I think human nature is to sort of band together with our own people who are like us, and then everything else is not good enough. You certainly have historical groups that I would never even post a message in because they, you know, oh, Rider-Waite-Smith, you know, law, you know, so it's just, it's funny. It's funny. There's room for everybody in the tarot world. And then this is the beautiful Marielle Tarot, which was came out in 2012, just as an example of obviously many modern decks that are currently being made, although I think that the Marielle is certainly an amazing example, because it is one, these are full paintings for each of the deck or each of the cards. I think that this took her like 10 years to paint, whereas nowadays we often do get some pretty fast published decks that, you know, you have to be a little more careful, a little more discerning about some mass-produced decks that are just kind of slapped together by artists sometimes who have no real understanding of tarot, or they're publishers that are taking pre-existing art and sticking them into tarot decks. And so we do sometimes, I think, in the modern sense of things, have to be a little bit discerning about the decks that we get. Not that they're not fine for collections, but in terms of reading, when you can tell, when you get comfortable with tarot, you can tell when you pick up a deck and the artist maybe really doesn't know much about tarot, or that the producer of the deck has simply tried to push images that were already made. They weren't made for that card, and they feel forced into the card that they're being used at. And so we have to kind of have a little bit of discernment, because I think that that causes problems for new readers who might pick up a deck because it's beautiful, it has beautiful artwork, but it oftentimes, sometimes they'll have a mix of like Thoth cards, Rider-Waite-Smith meaning cards, and a little bit of like playing card meanings to cards, and it has like a mix of systems in them, which can be really fascinating once you're comfortable with the system, to see how, you know, because that reflects how an individual has come to know. Like the Marielle is actually, I would say, more Thoth, but certainly is Thoth and Rider-Waite-Smith, and she talks about that because this is how she's developed and starts to see each of the cards. That's beautiful to see, but it can be confusing for a new person who is starting to read tarot, because then they're reading books and it's not matching up with the images that they're seeing on some of the modern decks. And so I do think that as especially beginning tarot readers, being discerning, looking at some reviews, really making sure that you're picking a deck that is cohesive, that is done by somebody who knows something about tarot, or at least by a publisher who knows something about tarot, is very helpful. But this is a beautiful example of a modern tarot deck. So we've kind of talked about these things, I think, from the beginning, or just in talking about this all. I know, again, if you've taken Lenormand, you expect this to be long. If you're new, sorry. But we're coming to the end here. We talked a little bit about this, but we do have to understand that there is a difference between sort of historical decks versus, say, Rider-Waite-Smith. And again, we're not going to touch on Thoth in this class. That is not something that I feel know enough to be qualified to teach. It's a different system in many ways. Obviously, there are many things that are similar, but it is but it does have its own correspondences, and it has, and so that's not something that we're going to be discussing in this class. So looking at these two things, in the understanding of historical decks, I think to understand that the minor arcana especially came out of playing card traditions, and so any associations such as elements, such as astrology, Kabbalah, those are the main things that you hear of a lot, but any of the layers of correspondences that are put on later, and there aren't any set structures to that. And so that's why you can read 3 books about astrology correspondences on tarot, and they might have variations. Most likely they will have variations. There isn't one astrological. We always think of Aries, very often you think of Aries as associated with the Emperor card, but that's something that's been placed onto it later. And somebody else might make a case for the Emperor being, say, Leo or something of that nature. So understand that any correspondences, including the elemental structure, as we'll talk about later, there are certainly, even in historical decks when they were starting to add, one of the people that I've really studied a lot and love his minors is Eudes Picard, and he was in the late 1800s to early 1900s, right, and wrote a book right around just before the Rider-Waite-Smith came out. He had the swords as water, and the cups as air. And so even before, now, certainly in the 1800s, when all of this esoteric knowledge was starting to, everybody said, oh, this could be this and this could be that. And all of that stuff was layered on later and is very changeable. And so you will see various people have their own, what works for them, what makes sense for them. And many of the books, while certain things stay fairly static, you will see differences, especially in astrological correspondences, but even in elemental correspondences. As I talked about before, there are people, I believe Wicca, which did do a lot with tarot as well. The wands were air because it's something that you wave around and you're manifesting your will. And the swords were fire because you plunge a sword is created out of fire. And it is much more active and destructive as fire can be. And you will see still decks today. I know the Modern Spellcasters Tarot is a deck that just came out that uses those correspondences, but you will find decks that have, especially very often it's the wands and the swords that get shifted. And you can't say, oh, that deck is wrong. It's not necessarily that's wrong. It's just that everybody had those correspondences are fluid. And if something doesn't feel right to you, that's why knowing, kind of seeing the options as we'll go through each of the cards and the suits and talk about those things, figuring out what really resonates with you, and then applying that consistently is something that becomes really important, because you will see various correspondences and there's really not a right and a wrong. Also the note that the trumps were added as a trick-taking games, but we do have separate history of the understanding of that progress, that there is that progress of man going from the Fool to the end. Although sometimes, I did want to remember to say this, sometimes the Fool is at 0, but sometimes the Fool is also set at 22. I personally see the Fool in both positions, which we'll talk about when we get next week in the major arcana. I think that part of the progression of being a human being is that the Fool starts, so we begin with that sort of open-chested, innocent, wide-eyed. We haven't learned a lot. We haven't been hit by life. We haven't been beaten down by life. We haven't had the difficulties. So we just go off on an adventure and we don't think twice. We go obviously through the whole of our life, and by the time we get to the World card, the key for me is that you've learned so much, you've gone through so many experiences, and then the hard part, but the magical part, is being able to, as a grown adult and somebody who's experienced life, to be able to get ourselves back to the position of the Fool, that despite and because of all the knowledge, to still be able to sort of let shields down and still face the world sort of chest open, as you often see the Fool, and be able to still experience the joy in life and the wonder in life and go out on this next adventure after having gone through everything that we've gone through. So I actually see the Fool positioned in both places. But historically, and sometimes you'll get decks, even today I've gotten decks where the Fool shows up after the major arcana instead of at the very first card. And that's why is that even that position of the Fool is flexible. Yes, and I didn't talk a lot about Attila, but he's really important in that he was one of the first to print. There was a book that he put out, which is in the timeline. If you go through the timeline, kind of linking astrology, the elements, the 4 humors, all of those things down. He did have a really suspect history. Again, there was a lot of competitions in order to sort of get higher up in societies. You had to be able to sort of publish cool papers. And so a lot of his things, and there was another person around the same time period that were really big into the whole Egyptian theme. And there's a lot of problematic things about the things that they wrote. But he was one of the first that actually wrote about esoteric meanings with tarot. And he was the first one to produce a deck that was made strictly for divination. In fact, I have reproduction of that, the Attila Tarot, which I'll leave out. We can look at if people who want to stick around. But that was the first deck that was produced that we know was produced for divination purposes, which is really interesting. But one of the problems with the Rider-Waite-Smith is that they did pull quite a bit from Atella. They pulled actually from a lot of different sources, and so that's where sometimes you get some what I consider to be some problematic correspondences in the Rider-Waite-Smith, and that's simply because they were pulling from various sources, and some of the sources we can now see were a little bit problematic. So we have that. I'm going to have to move this for a moment. Sorry to people watching this back. For the Rider-Waite-Smith, it's important to understand that this did come out of a society of esoteric people, right? They had all these sort of hierarchies of levels. The founders were like intercessories between the laymen and these secret chiefs, these ascended people. Some saw them as archetypal, but some saw them as actual secret chiefs that you could connect to energetically. So there was a lot of things. There were revolts that happened, there were splinter groups, there was reconstruction that happened. There's a lot of stuff that was going on with the Golden Dawn. And so understanding that the Rider-Waite-Smith and the Thoth, but definitely Rider-Waite-Smith, came out of this. If we don't know exactly what all the Golden Dawn believed, like what was their belief system, then we have to make sure that we come at correspondences with an open eye and understanding that of two things. A, it came out of this secret society of fallible people, and B, there are some evidence to show that Waite didn't want us to know all the secrets of the Golden Dawn, and so things were switched up on purpose. And so we always have to take things with the eye of understanding that these associations and even these scenes that are on a Rider-Waite-Smith card, that if it comes up in a reading and you mean something different to you, and we'll again talk about those things when we get to the actual cards, that's okay. There's nothing about in my opinion, the tarot cards are a tool. And because we know of the fluid history in which they've had, it's okay to come up with correspondences that resonate the strongest with you, even if that goes against what you might see on a card. As if you've taken my Lenormand class, you'll hear me say this a lot in the next 6 weeks. For me, any divination system is about coming to a personal understanding of those correspondences that work for you and then applying it consistently. We don't want to be overly fluid so that every time a card comes up, we just, oh, well, that means such and such, just because it says what you want it to say in that moment. So you do want to have a structure, and you do want to have an understanding of what the cards mean to you, and you want to apply that consistently. That's far more important than just saying, okay, well, this has a picture of XYZ, so this is what it is. Now, there are ways of reading that way. It's called intuitive reading, where people don't learn any base knowledge of the cards, and they just go off of the images. And that's certainly a style in which people read. That's not the style in which we are going to be learning in the next 6 weeks. I come from a school of thought on all things, not just tarot, that having a core understanding is a wonderful jumping off platform to then use your intuition. But I do think that for me personally, I believe it's important to have a core understanding, more important even than the historical academic understanding, is you coming up with what works for you and then applying that consistently over and over again. So I just want to make it clear that even the things that are so structured in the Rider-Waite-Smith, these are just placed there by people and a specific actual person and out of a group in the early 1900s, and you're not locked into that. This is this beautiful system, and we're going to talk about next week a little bit more about the actual structure. There is so much to be gained just from the basic structure of tarot, and then you can start to put on what correspondences are important to you. Again, with the Rider-Waite-Smith, understand that there are images taken all the way back from the Sola Busca, which is, I don't have listed in historical because it doesn't actually have the same major arcana or anything. It's kind of before that, but you can see, and I'll try to find it when we do the minors, I'll show you, but the Three of Swords in the Rider-Waite-Smith is from the Sola Busca. We know that Pamela Coleman Smith saw cards in the museum, and it's taken from that very first deck. Some of it was taken from Eliphas Levi, which was a big into the Kabbalah in the 1800s, and a lot of it was also, the minors were taken from Attila. So they kind of did this pick from different sources, and so that's why sometimes some of the correspondences can be like, okay, wow, we just took that leap there, right? They did mute down some of the Christian imagery, because one of the things that we have to remember is that the tarot came out of Italy and then France, and a time in which the Roman Catholic Church was the reigning religion, and certainly was, even if somebody wasn't necessarily considered themselves religious, which wouldn't, be very often, they were still heavily influenced by Roman Catholicism and the Christian ideology. And so that's why you did, in the older cards, the High Priestess was a papist, which is really cool. We'll talk a little bit more about that next week. But that was really neat during that time period, that they had strong imagery of a female pope, which was not something that would have been condoned by the church. There was a lot of actually subversive things within some of the major arcana that are, I think, fascinating. But when the Rider-Waite-Smith took the cards, they changed the Pope to the Hierophant, which is what we see today. The Papist was changed to the High Priestess, but then they did leave some, like the Devil and the Judgment card, and the Lovers definitely stayed more of that. You could see references to the Garden of Eden in the Lovers card. It's also important to note that Waite swaps Justice to 11 and Strength to 8. So all the way up till 1909. Again, the beginning of history, there was definitely variances in the structure of the order of the major arcana, but by the Dodal and the Noble, things have pretty well stabilized, and for quite a long time stayed that way. And Justice was at 8, and Strength was at 11. And we will talk more about what that means next week when we're talking about the major arcana, because that is one of those decisions, if you're using numerology, that's a decision that's quite important to make. Crowley, who is again also Golden Dawn, he put them out as Justice as 8 and Strength as 11. That is actually the correspondence for the Golden Dawn. Waite, for the Rider-Waite-Smith, changes them because he wanted the order of the astrological sign correspondences to be in the order that he, in the typical astrological order of signs. And so he put 8, or Strength in at 8, and put Justice in at 11. But that was a major switch. And again, we will talk a little bit more about that next week with the majors, but that's an important switch. And so you will often find, even today, you'll find decks that either have, majority, if they're based off of the Rider-Waite-Smith, will have Strength at 8 and Justice at 11, but you will get decks in which those are switched, and or you're starting to see a lot more where the major cards are not numbered, and that way, however it is that you tend to see those, you're not stuck by the numbers. And so I personally go more of the historical way. So for me, I tend to see Justice at 8 and Strength at 11. But that is because I read very numerologically based, which again, we'll talk about more in the next 2 weeks, but I did want to point that out because that was a major flip, and it was, the reason that it was done was because he was trying to line the signs up, but it wasn't even a Golden Dawn correspondence. They keep it at the way that it was traditionally done. So Just, and I'm going to whiz through this really quick. And let me put things back because I know for people watching back, I've moved my face around a bit, which is going to be a little annoying, but I want to make sure you can see. We're going to be talking about the individual structures much more. You know, next week we'll be focused on the major arcana. There are several ways in which you can structure the major arcana that are really interesting, and we'll be talking about next week. And certainly we'll be talking more about the structure of the minor arcana when we get to the minor arcana. So the purpose of this is not to go in depth. You have sort of what you see here in your handouts as well, so that you can look at it. But you know, basically we have a major arcana of 22 cards. The Fool often is seen as 0 as the first card, but sometimes will show up as the 22nd card. But we have 0 Fool and 21 the World card. The way that we structure the major arcana, and we'll again talk about this more next week, so don't get flustered, you know, if we aren't going into detail, because there's a couple ways that you can arrange the major arcana that gets quite fascinating. But very often the Fool and the World card kind of stand outside, and then you have these 20 cards that kind of show the progression of man. So we have that for the major arcana. Again, on this image, I've just highlighted the fact that we have Strength in the Rider-Waite-Smith as 8 and Justice as 11. In the next image, we'll see it the way that it originally is. We have 56 cards of the minor arcana based off of traditional playing cards, but there's an extra court card. Sometimes the older playing cards had sort of a Jack, a knight and a king, and there were no queens. Sometimes as then of course, as we tend to see playing cards, a Jack, a queen, and a king. And so in that case, the knight has been added in. In the older decks, it was more likely that the queen was added in to make a 4-court system. Again, we'll be talking about those all when we get there. And I've already talked about the fact that additional correspondences are things that have been layered on. We're going to, hopefully by the end of this class, you have an idea of what resonates with you so that you can start to apply that consistently. This is just an example of the major arcana with from the CBD, which would have been a Marseille style deck. And again, you can see that Justice would have been number 8, and Force or Strength would have been number 11. And you'll also see in older decks, and sometimes we see this in modern decks as well, that Death does not have a title to it. So you'll see here that the Death card does not have a title on it, and that was quite traditional, that Death did not have title on it, and some modern card decks do see that, have that happen as well. So if you get a deck where Death is not titled, it's not because they messed it up, they're just kind of giving that nod to the historical aspect of that card. Then of course we have the minors, and on your handout I've mixed them all up because you know you're going to get these individual breakdowns in when we get to the minors. I didn't want you to have to print them out twice, but I've kind of shown, we'll just quickly go through the slides where we have obviously wands, and this is in the Marseille style, where you can see the wands are just simply the numbers of wands, but there's some wonderful things that you can glean from this. Every odd card has a wand breaking through it, and it shows the odd numbers as being sort of shake-up numbers, not necessarily negative numbers, but they are definitely shake-up numbers. And so there's a lot you can glean. Very often in pip style decks, the wands are going to be straight and the swords are going to be curved. That's my favorite way. I look for that in a pip deck because it's easier to see in a reading, oh, that's a wand, or oh, that's a sword. And then of course we have the Rider-Waite-Smith version of that. We also have swords. You can see the curved swords here, and then we can see the Rider-Waite-Smith, that heart card here, number 3. Again, that was directly from the Solabusca back in the 1400s, which is pretty awesome. My biggest issue with the Rider-Waite-Smith is with the sword suit, simply because I read numerologically along with the element. We're going to talk about that in the minors. And so often in decks, the 3 of swords, the certainly the 9 and the 10 of swords are ones, and even the 7 of swords are ones that I read quite differently than the Rider-Waite Smith, and so I have to kind of talk around that. I still use the decks. I simply have to I understand that my clients can understand when I say, okay, this is a typical Rider-Waite Smith image, but the number 7 means XYZ, and sword suit is about the mind. This is what it means, and it works perfectly fine. We'll talk about that more again when we get to the minors. Here we have the beautiful cups, sometimes known as chalices. Beautiful imagery here. I particularly like the 9 of cups with this guy just happily sitting here. The 9 of hearts, which is what the 9 of cups came from, was known as the wish card, or the wish fulfillment card. Sort of that is something that has carried over into the reading of the 9 of cups that I quite like. Then we have the coins that would have originally been called coins. Now we very often see pentacles. As you can see here, they look more like coins in the CBD tarot, and where in the Rider-Waite Smith we do have the pentacles that we often see in modern decks, although sometimes we still do get throwbacks to the coins as well. And that's the sort of basic structure. Again, we're going to go much more into structure when we look at the individual pieces of tarot, but suffice it to say, if you're brand new to tarot, there is a major arcana of 22 cards and a minor arcana of 56 cards. Very often people look at the major arcana as bigger issues. They are bigger energies that are at play, whereas the minor arcana is much more everyday life, much more the common issues that we are faced with during life, and smaller energies, excuse me, smaller energies than the major arcana, and that's the basic structure of tarot. And we'll dig into it a little bit further. Let me switch out of here before I take any questions here. 1 second. I'm going to stop the share. There we go. We made it successfully back. We are still recording. Good. Let me get the chat back. And I don't know if I am spotlighted, so let me make sure I'm spotlighted. There we go. Okay, so we should be back. Another drink, another drink. So if you're all still, did we lose anybody? I don't think we lost anybody. Hi, Sean Marie. I don't think I saw you sneak in. If you came in after I started babbling, hello to you. Okay, so any questions? If you want to throw questions in here, go for it. If you have to leave, go for it. I'm gonna just probably pull a couple random decks, more historical decks that I have, just to kind of talk about them and show them a little bit for the people who want to stick around. And if you have questions, but if you have to leave, you know, I totally understand that. Jada says, what is the name of the Atala tarot that you prefer? I only have, so I haven't worked with this a whole lot. This is, I think Los Carabio put this out, and right now, I think this only came through some kind of offer they did. I can't remember what it was. Somebody that I know accidentally got 2 of them, and so she sent the second one to me. So I haven't really looked at it, but this was actually a reproduction, obviously, of the first deck that was created for the purpose of divination. And so he has he's written, and I think the original one, it was literally handwritten, and so he has like Aries on here. He had sort of meanings of reverse, because he was one of the first people that started to talk about reversals and there being different meanings, whether it was upright or reversed, and so he had those meaning, astrological correspondences. He changes, I think, the order of the minor or the major arcana up a little bit, but you can see like all kinds of little notations, and this was just one of those decks. You can get this. I really don't. It's not a system I work with. You can certainly see some of the cards being the same. Let me get a minor. You'll see he has the minors are just strict minors. that he puts in there, like they're really just literally, you know, swords sitting there. Like there's really not even a lot of illustrations. But he does, like, so for example, he does have, that would be the, you know, on these two cards, which are coins, he has the north and south lunar nodes on them. So he puts a lot of different, and even has down here sort of the path of the moon. So he puts correspondences and things of that nature onto the deck and publish it that way. And it was the first deck that we know was, you know, produced for the sake of reading, as he had first put a book out on playing cards, reading with playing cards, and then mentioned in there reading divinatory with tarot as separate from playing cards. And that was one of the first written indications that seeing playing cards and tarot as two separate things and two separate types of divination. So that's one of the interesting things about Atella, although again, he has a very complicated history that seemed to be much more intent on moving up the ranks in esoteric society than on getting things overly accurate. So that's, I think that there are other ways to get the Atella deck. I don't know of them. I just think that there are still other publications. I think certainly but I looked at it at one time. I think it's some of those things you have to go to like an Italian site and try to be able to order it, or through, I think, the UK Amazon I've seen before, where you can get a version of the Atella, the Grand Atella, which is often how you'll see it labeled as the Grand Atella. A lot of Lo Scarabeo does a really good job. They have a series of like ancient decks in which they reproduce historical decks. So you can very often get historical reproductions through Lo Scarabeo for, you know, cheap prices. This is the Ancient Italian, which is a reproduction of the Soprafino. Yes, the Book of Thoth by Lo Scarabeo you can get quite, although I think some of those images are different. There are two types of Atellas. I think one is an actual reproduction and one has sort of been redrawn. Often with historical decks, that's what you'll get. Some are literal reproductions of the cards. Some are repaintings or redrawings of the cards. So depending on whether you're collecting for historical accuracy or just because you want exposure, you know, that's something to look for with. And yeah, there were more than one version, I think, that he put out, Bart is making note of. So that is interesting. But again, with Lo Scarabeo, they do seem to be trying to put out, and they have an ancient line, and they're still putting more and more out. This is the Soprafino. Again, if you get into some of the minors, it's actually one of the most beautiful illustrated minors. And this is, the Lo Scarabeo is prettier than, you can get it through Il Menigalo. It's going to cost quite a bit more because he produces decks like they used to produce decks, which is amazing, but you're obviously going to pay for that because this is you know, paper that they used to use and the process that they used to use, and so they can get quite expensive, but they are absolutely beautiful. I'll show you a couple that I do have. But this Lo Scarabeo you can get on Amazon, probably, I don't know, it's been a while, I would say probably 20 to 25 is my guess. Jade is nodding, so I'm guessing around that. And it's you know, that's gorgeous. It's absolutely stunning. And this is what I was talking about. Very often in old decks, the wands look like these giant clubs they're going to beat each other with. It's like, what in the heck? That we think of them as magic wands, but I don't think that was originally what they were. But they're beautiful. One of my absolute favorite decks. So I'm really impressed with Lo Scarabeo. They did recently the Solabusca. You can get the Solabusca from Lo Scarabeo, and they did an amazing job. These are often what backings of older cards look like. The Madrone looks similar to this. And they did an amazing job. This is a deck where it's almost all men. There are some women. It's based on mythological and historical men. This would have been previous to Sforza and the Madrone. And so the major arcana is not the way that we see the major arcana at all. But it's neat just to have, like, if you're into the history of tarot, because this is certainly one of the first tarot type decks. You know, that's just really beautiful. And also you can, it's certainly, let me see if I can find the heart, but you can see even in the minors, like these are illustrated minors with actual scenes. This would be the three of coins. And so they, you know, the fact, and this one especially here, this is really beautiful. Somebody's working. So it's definitely, the Rider-Waite-Smith did not start the idea of scenic minors. This would be back in the early 1400s. I'm gonna see if I can find, but you know how it is when you go to try. Also, I know the 10 of Wands, the Rider-Waite-Smith 10 of Wands with the 10, you know, that they're carrying on their back, that was actually the 10 of Swords from the Solabusca, which again, we know that Pamela Coleman Smith saw in the library, and it is exactly the 10 of Swords from, I do like the Queens. I'm just gonna try to find the hearts. Oh, here it is, here's a 3. So that's from the Solabusca in the 1400s. And so, but my point, rambling point being, I think that Lo Scarabeo is one of those mass market companies that seems to be doing a great job at reproducing some of these historical decks that are normally quite expensive to get. You can get them in Italy. You can get them in museums in France and Italy. They often have reproductions. There are still companies in Italy that are doing decks, but they often are quite expensive to get a hold of. One of my absolute favorite ever decks is the Neoclassico, which I think you can only, no, I think Lo Scarabeo has, I cannot remember what it's called. I think that Lo Scarabeo has a version of this as well. I cannot remember for the life of me what it's called, but it is, to me, if you're into like Jane Eyre, I feel like if Jane Eyre read tarot, this would be her deck. It's just, it's very, very simple. This is an El Menegalo version, and so the paper, when you shuffle it, it's just shushing that is so awesome. But it's really, really beautiful, sweet. Look how simple that is with that little flower and the little sort of delicate border. This would have been from 1810 is when this was put out. But absolutely beautiful. This and the Ancient Italian Tarot, or the Soprafina, are probably my two most favorite historical decks, and maybe the Fino della Torre. So they can get quite expensive, is my point, but you can now very often find them. We won't be talking too much about this, but this was from the 1700s, but there was in the 1500s a version of tarot that came out called the Minciati. And you can get several versions of this deck. This is I think out of print Lo Scarabeo version. I know Il Menegalo does it, but it adds to the majors. The 12 astrological signs are added in. There's 4 element cards, and it makes sure to show the 4 virtues. So the 4 virtues are something that were really important historically, and we see them in Temperance. We see them in the Star card. Can't remember what the third one is. The High Priestess, I think, is one of the virtues as well. The Minciati deck has the 4 virtues card added in, the 4 elements and the 12 astrological signs. Like this, well, that's actually Judgment. There's no question about Judgment here. You also see very often Strength has been, we'll talk about this when we get to next week, but it used to be called Force, and there were a lot more cards that were more force related, whereas a man like literally fighting with a lion, or a woman holding a giant pillar very often, sometimes actually trying to hold. It was much more about physical strength than the way that we see strength today. But this was Minciati is a neat little deck. And there are some modern decks that do it. The Duck Soup, who does a lot of, I know I have their Arthur Rackham Oracle. He does a circus one called the Zircus Magi or something like that. And he's added in the astrological sign, the 4 element signs. You can get those as additions. So you do see a little bit of modern decks starting to play with Minciati, which is fun. This particular one, they're usually called just Minciati, Minciate. So it was a variation. It was a variation of tarot. And I know you can get, I know El Menegalo still sells the Minciati. I think Lo Scarabeo still sells a version. This one, which is the Etruria, is the one that you see the most, which this is based off of. Even though this is out of print, it's not like, I think my friend Itzy found this for like $15. Like you can still find it fairly cheap, even though it's out of print. I don't know if there's any other. Oh, the Bendov deck. I don't have that out here. I don't think it's called the CBD. In fact, if you go, I'll type. Can I type? Yeah. Let me type it to everyone. You can go to CBD. Yes, right now, because Yoav Bendov passed away last year. His son has taken everything over. Of course, they are trying to sort things out and get things. So he has said that they will be selling the CBD tarot. Again, I think that's what Jay is talking about, is the CBD. Because I have heard as well that you can pre-order that. It is going to be put out, but he does have all. If you go to the cbdtarot.com, you can download printable sized files. He kept all of that up there, as well as his little white book, which if you don't want to print, if you don't want to print it out or purchase his full book, it's taken from the open reading book, but it has a lot of good information right there, which is really nice to be able to print for free and be able to have that if it's not something that you want. Although I highly recommend that book if you're interested, as well as if you have an Android phone. I don't think there's one for the iPhone. I remember I hated it when I switched to the iPhone, although I haven't checked recently. But if you have an Android phone, you can get a CBD app. And it's actually fantastic because it has all of the, what do the different colors mean? How do you read things directionally? A lot of the core components of the book are in that app. So if you either have an Android tablet or phone, that's also an option as well. Yeah, so Bart's putting up a link there as well of a library that has tons of different images and being able to see historical tarot decks as well as Lenormand decks that you can download. There's a lot that are available in public domain. Again, you can't sell them, but for your own personal use, you're able to print those things out and have access to some of the older decks. I don't think if I have any other decks that are, I got my friend Itzy, and Patrick got me this for my birthday last year. So this is an Il Menegalo deck box that he creates by hand. It's not wood, it looks like it, but he layers papers. He does it all the old way. And then this is, which I'm in the midst of trimming or edging, but this is the Sforza that you can get from Il Menegalo. They're huge, so you can see, and these are size of the decks, the original decks. So they're really big cards, and you can kind of see right here where that hole that I was talking of is, these were hand painted, again, gold gilded. These were not things that people were shuffling and playing cards with, but they are beautiful. And you can get versions of this. The US Games has put out a really nice version for obviously much cheaper than this. It's still full size, but you can also get a beautiful, I think it's by Cat Black, I have it, but you can get a beautiful repainting of the Sforza that in some ways is more beautiful. Like here's an interesting version of Strength. He's not actually going to beat the lion. If you look closely, they're both looking at the same thing, which is really cool when you think about them, the civilized and the wild South working together to defeat. This is very modern take that we see the Strength card as. And this is 1400. So it's quite interesting to see. Again, you've got the miners as being beautiful pip cards. But it is really neat to be able to just, in the modern age, be able to see these cards. And again, they're huge. they're humongous, but he does, like when he prints, and they are really expensive, but he prints them in layers. Like he doesn't just print it like we see, like they go through several processes of printing, you know, and it's old cardstock. It's just amazing. If you see images of, he's in his 80s now, so I don't know how much longer he'll be doing it, but it's neat to see still some of the old ways of doing things. You can still go there and see those kinds of things. But, and then on the other hand, we have Los Carabio, and even now US Games starting to reproduce some of these older decks, which is amazing. I know the case, I think the case is more expensive. I didn't purchase it, but I'm pretty sure it's as expensive or not more so, because he layers paper, he paints everything by hand. It's pretty amazing. So let's see, did I answer all of the questions? If you have any other questions, please feel, oh, I know, I was going to quickly, again, if you have to leave, I'm a babbler. I love tarot, clearly. I love it. I love all things divinatory, and I love, love, love tarot. And so I get excited to talk to other people who are, now I got stuff everywhere. And so I babble. So let me just quickly show, because I want you, let's see, did I stop recording? No. Okay, because I want to have this on the record. I'm just going to quickly go over, let me see how to do this. I haven't done this before. You can be my, for love of divination. Okay, so then I think I can share the screen. Okay, so I'm gonna try this. We'll see if it works. Somebody can nod at me if it looks right. I'm gonna go to Chrome and share the screen. So let me put it where I can see everybody's face for a second. Can somebody nod at me? Oh yeah, okay, thank you, Caitlin. I thumbs up. Okay, so this is, I'm going to try this out. A lot of people I know who were in my Lenormand class are taking this class. I had tried a forum on my website. Part of the reason, you know, I really struggled with the format of these classes. A lot of modern classes now, you purchase the class, you get all of the videos and the handouts and everything at one. It's kind of it's a self-taught system. Or else there's videos, but it's all done, and you simply, you don't. It's not a class situation. But I actually really like the setup of a class. I like getting to know students that are taking the class. I like that people have certain questions, or I know that people are struggling with something, and so then I can address that. I just like the format of it, going through a class with people, with each other. And so so I really struggled with that and decided on doing it in this format where people can still watch it back if they can't do it live, but that there are live classes, and there are actually a class that's kind of going through this together. And so the forums, I think, are one way in which you all are able to interact with each other, ask questions when we start to have homework next week where you're pulling cards, that kind of thing. You're able to talk about it and chit chat about it. And so I tried forums on my website. I did Facebook with my first geomancy class, but there's actually quite a lot of people who don't use Facebook and don't want to use Facebook. And I used it on my website last for my Lenormand class, which worked fine, but there's no way to separate those off and allow for, then to have a tarot class and then to have different, it's just very basic structure. So I'm trying this time, and hopefully this works, in order to, again, for people after the Lenormand class is done to be able to still have a place to go to. So you'll see when you come, when you go to For Love of Divination, there are all different forums here. I've set up some basic ones, again, really focus on divination, types of divination. So feel free to, a couple people asked if they were able to go in. Anything that's on this front page with these forums, you can, pop something there if you've got a new Oracle deck or you have a question about something. Again, we're just getting started, so there's not a lot of people on there. And the purpose of this is going to be really focused on people who have taken classes with me and or gotten readings through with me, that type of thing. So my intention is for it to stay somewhat in that forum to support each other. But you'll see at the top here, so anything in the forums, again, people have asked me that. All of these forums are open to your using, whether you're taking this class now or you've taken classes. Of course, you wouldn't be seeing this if you didn't, but it's open to anybody who's taking classes with me. But if you click over here to groups, I'm creating a specific group for the tarot class. And so that way, the things that are in the tarot class are things that only people taking the tarot class will have access to. And that's so we can put links to the videos in there, homework. It's just a little bit more private. And so you can click in there, you'll see I have an introduction. After this video is uploaded, that will be in there as well. We can start new topics. There's a topic, you can click over here to topics. So there's a welcome topic, so you can go in and introduce yourself. Class links topics, again, I'll be putting the links to the classes. And I will start a new topic for how did you get in, you know, what got you into tarot? How did you first encounter tarot? What is your tarot story? So that would kind of be, if you have any kind of homework, that would be to, if you're using the forums, pop in there and leave like how you got interested in tarot. I'd love to see that. But you will join up here. When you first join up, you won't be able to, I think, leave any comments or anything until I go in and okay the thing, and then I will, for the tarot class, again, you've had links to it, but I will put links, again, it's gonna be very linky email for today, but I will put a link to this forum again. And if you if you register and make sure that you email me back and tell me what your name was, the username that you've created, because then I will add you to the tarot class. And the next time that you come into the forum, you should get an invite. You'll have notifications up here near the top, a notification, like there's a notification here, I think, for a message, or where somebody commented on something that I had. So this is probably going to be lit up, and you'll have an invite to the tarot group, and then you'll be able to go into the tarot group. And again, these are more just specifically for class. If you are just talking about other things that you want to talk about, you can go into any of the forum. If you have a suggestion for a type of divination that you want me to add in, go ahead and do that. But we're going to try that for, I think this is going to work better, because then as I have different classes running, those can have their own separate groups. And so when we start to do homework, I will make a topic thing for homework. So like with Lenormand, some people put up their readings if they wanted to get feedback from their classmates. And that was really nice to be able to see. You get sort of different visions of how people see the cards. Obviously, the intent for this group is to simply be supportive and an atmosphere of learning. And so always, post in kind that we are here to support each other in the process, the wonderful process of learning of divination. So that's the purpose of the forum. It is not necessary. I've also gotten that question. It is not necessary. There is nothing going on the forums or in the group that you will have to have in order to take the class. It is just something extra if you want to be able to interact with or communicate with your classmates. And again, it's a great place to keep. So if you have a question, you can go into the tarot class and you can start a new topic right here. And so say you have a question, especially as we get into more things, but even today, if you've watched the video and you have a question after this class is over with, I always go by the rule that if you have a question, more than likely at least one or two other people are going to be thinking the same thing. And so it's very helpful if you have a specific question, pop it up there. Obviously, if it's a personal nature, you'll want to email me. But if it's just a question on the class, make a topic of that, because then if you have the question, somebody else probably does. And so then when I answer that, that's going to help obviously everybody else that's in there as well. So it's a great way to also be able to ask questions of me. And so, but again, it is not necessary. You will not miss out anything. There will not be any information other than my responses to questions and things. There won't be anything in the forums that you're going to miss out, that you're going to have in order to go through the next 6 weeks. So I wanted to make that clear because people had asked that as well. So I'm going to stop this sharing and come back here. We're still recording. Yay. I feel like a professional. It's working all really well. So, okay, I think I'm going to wrap it up. It's 2 o'clock. If anybody has any other questions, speak now or speak later in the forums. But I really appreciate everybody popping on. And definitely some people have came in after we started, so hello to you and goodbye to you. It was great to see you at the end anyways, and I look forward to next week. So again, the same thing will happen as did this week. I try to, by Wednesday or Thursday, have your handouts for next week, as well as the Zoom link for the next week that you're able to click on to come into. So usually I try to do them. I have it scheduled for myself because I do actually have another job too. So I try to schedule doing it on Wednesday, but that often means I'm doing it at like midnight. And so it may not get to you till Thursday. But that's when I try to shoot for, so that you have be able to print the handouts out. I do apologize. The next 2 weeks will be heavily. Again, you're not required to print them out. They're just more extra. I try to have all of the information or the important information on the slides in the handout so that you have those, in hand to be able to read those types of things later on. And again, the next 2 weeks will have a page for each one of the cards that will have an image from the CBD and an image from the Rider-Waite-Smith, as well as just some basic keywords and of how Rider-Waite-Smith and how you might read that as a more the way I read it, basically. So I have Rider-Waite-Smith, basically how I see it with numerology and the elements, and some basic correspondence. I haven't decided, because I don't really want this to be about, not everybody uses astrology, but I'll probably put just sort of key traditional correspondences, just so that you have access to those, to think about the different ways in which people use them. But then the majority of the page will just have lines for you to start taking notes, either during class if something about that card, because we are going to talk about every single card. And so if something pops in, you'll have a place for notes. We did that with Lenormand, and I think it worked really well, just to have that resource. So again, you're not required to print it. I know they're very print heavy, they're very color heavy. You can, remember, print them out in black and white or grayscale. You can also, especially if you're in the US, you can go on to Office Max, Kinko's, all certain places like that, and you can have them printed there, which is sometimes cheaper than using up all of your ink in your personal printer. Sometimes it's easier to do it that way, but I do like to have pretty things my own self. So yeah, so you'll get those. So you'll get next week's, it should be Wednesday or Thursday, you'll get the new link, as well as your handouts for next week. We'll be looking at the major arcana, and I'm very excited about that. And so I will see you guys all next week.